is Charles Winters Wilson. The Winters part came from the doctor that delivered me in Dublin, Texas. That was June the 9th of 1921. Dublin, Texas. And that was my mother's hometown. Her parents came on covered wagons to Texas when they were young people from around Georgia. They were married when they got there, and their names was Long. Her name was Willie C. Long, and her husband, my grandfather, was named Charles Batty Long, B-A-T-T-Y. And the grandmother was born 10/7, 1872. And the grandfather was born January 31st, 1866. So that covers the mother's side of the family. My daddy was named Walter Byron Wilson, who was a son of John F. Wilson of Brownwood, Texas, born in Brownwood in 1850. His wife was named Florence Wilson. I don't know her, I don't remember her maiden name. But she was also born in Brownwood in 1851. They had 3 children. That was one uncle and 2 sisters. And they were all grew up and died, passed away in Brownwood, and were all buried in Brownwood. And of course my daddy came along he was the baby of the Wilson family. Now they came from Kentucky, and they also came to Texas in covered wagons. And my dad, it's in the history book, Brown County, Texas, he helped plant the first government pecan orchard in the state of Texas. And he ended up in that business. He ended up as a pecan broker, and that's why we lived in Fort Worth most of all my life when I was at home. I was an only child, and right after I came along, a depression came along. 29, I was just a kid. And it was tough living. It was, I can tell anybody, that was a tough time of life in Texas or anywhere else in the United States. And my poor dad had to go out. He didn't have money sometimes to get on the streetcar that ran in front of our house to get downtown and look for work. He'd walk. And of course, we had to get rid of the car in those days, I remember, and it was very sad living. But we didn't lose our home like a lot of our neighbors did. I remember that. It just broke my heart to see my kids I was playing with, and they having to move out, mattresses and all. And that was sad days for Texas and America. When I was a kid on Fairmount Street, Fairmount and Berry, near TCU, there were 2 railroads that you could see from our house. It was kind of on a hill there in South Fort Worth. You could see the Frisco Railroad, and you could also, on the other side of the street, 2 or 3 blocks away, you could see the Santa Fe Railroad. Believe it or not, those cars were covered like there were ants. Good people out looking for jobs, family men, sons, uncles, grandfathers, and those cars would be covered. I wish I had a picture of it today. I've never seen one since then. But that was history. That's history for America, what was going on in those days, because it was tough. I don't know why I'm preaching on it now, but it's a thing that you remember in life when you especially live through one of them. And a lot of times you wonder what's on the table, in fact, every meal. And if there was something, you're lucky. I kept waiting for my paper route to materialize. And finally the guy thought, well, now you're in high school, you're old enough to take your paper route. Well, they gave me one 3 miles from my home, but that was right. I had a bicycle. And if you all know, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram was an issue, and the Fort Worth afternoon paper, and then the Sunday paper. I delivered all those, and then went to high school. And I'd have to come home and ride my bike back the 3 miles where the high school was. High school was on my paper route. So I favor remembering those days and the people that lived through it. My dad, he was in World War I in the Air Force. My dad never left the States, but he was taking flying training when the war ended, so he never did finish up his work as a pilot. But I kind of wanted to be a pilot because he didn't quite make it, and when I was going to school at Arlington, NTAC at Arlington, between Fort Worth and Dallas, and taking aeronautical engineering. And I learned to be a good hitchhiker, so I hitchhiked every day from Fort Worth to Arlington and back. So finally the war was going real good, and a neighbor of mine came back from the Canadian Air Force, and he stopped by my house and showed me his uniform, and I said, well, what the heck is this? He said, well, I'm in the Canadian Air Force, I'm a pilot. Well, he was a pilot before he went up there as a pilot instructor in Canada. James Cunningham later got killed in an airplane. And so one day I told my folks, even though I was an only child, I told my folks I'm gonna go to Canada, and some way, without too much crying, they agreed with me, and my mother took me to the highway in a couple of days. And I'll never forget, I had $7. I had a $5 bill and two $1 bills in my pocket. And I hit that highway north of Fort Worth. In about 5 days, I was in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. And of course, the guy on the American side, on the Detroit side, knew what I was doing, but I told a few lies. I said, I'm just going over to see the scenery and meet the Canadians. And he laughed and he said, be careful, son. He said, the office is just down the street where they hiring the pilot. So I went down there, but I was so worn out, they stuck me in a YMCA for about a week to fatten me up. I must have lost about 10 pounds, and I didn't weigh but 140 then. So as it went, it all came out good, and they sent me off to several schools, and I received my wings in Dauphin, Manitoba about a year later. And I was a full-fledged pilot, sergeant pilot. My first plane that I soloed in was called a Tiger Moth. I was very happy with the whole deal. I made a trip to England in a Lockheed Hudson bomber. Took some big wheels over and brought some big wheels back to Halifax, Nova Scotia. When I was there, the train came up from Washington. And they said, if you want to go, you can. So I went into there were 4 cars there was Navy and Marine Corps and 2 Army cars, Army Air Force. So I went in a Navy car, and they offered me an ensign if I'd join up with them, all just begging me to. So I said, well, let me think, let me go look at the Marine Corps. So I went to the Marine Corps, and they offered me a second lieutenant as a pilot. So I said, well, my daddy was in the Army, so were my uncles. So we'll go into the train that had the cars, and they had the Army all set up with their desk and their people, working. And they offered me a sergeant job as a pilot, sergeant pilot, they call us. So I took it. And I'm thinking, boy, you stupid, but it didn't turn out that way. It was better that I went in the Army, because I couldn't have taken that Navy stuff. And so finally, we get on a train heading for old slow passenger train those days, headed south, and got to Montgomery, Alabama. And they sent 4 of us, only 4 went down it the first time. We were standing there in our blue sergeant uniform with our stripes upside down. They didn't know, when we were standing on the corner, they didn't know what to do with us. The MPs came by and took us to their office and wondered who we are. So some major in there had heard about us, and that we were sergeant pilots. Well, where are you standing? We're standing in a place they gave us to stay here. We got a barracks thing to stay in. So they finally latched on to us, and the next day they had us down flying AT-6s. And I got to fly the first one, and checked out that day as a pilot on the AT-6. And then they sent me to Tyndall Field, and that's where I was sent from being a sergeant to second lieutenant. All those became second lieutenants. Well, first we became flight officers, which was a rank that nobody knows about now. It's a blue thing up there, but we're treated as an officer, have lunch in officers club and everything, but we're still half enlisted men. They were trying to copy the British, but they really didn't know how to do it. So it was rather funny. So the colonel took a liking to me. He said, "How would you like to go to Sebring, Florida and check out as a captain on the B-17? I said, "Well, I've seen pictures of B-17s. That's a bomber, isn't it?" He says, "Well, yeah, would you like to fly one?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir, man, it wouldn't. It's kind of off of it, Colonel." And he says, "Okay, pack up and get yourself a ride down there, and you'll be there when I'm sending two officers with you because they're going to check out too." So I was the first enlisted man in the history of the Air Force to check out on a four-engine airplane as a captain, for which I've always been proud of. And then I got transferred to Wright-Patterson Field in Dayton, Ohio, and I was a test pilot on a certain kind of airplane. It was a little twin-engine gunner, they called it. And it was tricycle gear and inline engines, they'd call them, or Raptor, you know. It wasn't a radial engine. And then I got to fly A-20s, A-26s, P-38s, P-40s, P-47s. I got to fly all that stuff, and all I'd have to do is go say, "Hey, Sergeant, how do you start it?" and get in and drive off. So I enjoyed that quite a bit. Then finally they called me down and said, "You got orders to go to England," so I went to England. Well, they assigned me a crew, and we trained with the crew before I left the United States with the airplane and the crew. I was 100 miles north of London, south of Norwich. We were a little town called Thorpe Abbotts, just a little village. And we get over there and we do some more practice work and formation work and what have you. And then they put me on the right wing of a guy, and I took my first mission, my second mission to Cologne, Germany. Both of them were to Cologne, Germany. I think we lost 2 airplanes, saw both airplanes go down. I thought, ooh, those guys are gonna go make it. They're spinning it on fire, you know, and it kind of made you think, what am I doing here? And then I became a lead pilot in England in the 8th Air Force, 100th Bomb Group, which is a very famous, today is a very famous bomb group with a lot of good history behind it. They'd wake you up about 4 o'clock, seemed like 3 to 4 o'clock. So we would finally get down the line and we'd go to a briefing at this one hangar and tell us what we're going to do, pull the curtain back, show us. That's the first thing we knew where we were going. And then they'd take us on trucks out to the airplane, and we'd finally get the thing going, and by daylight we were all taking off, one right after the other. And then you go out to a certain point that they designated ahead of time, and then you'd make, if you was leading a crew like I did after about 8 missions, you just make a turn and they'd all come up there and keep turning on you until you got in that squadron of 12 or 13 airplanes would be in together, and then there'd come another one, and then all 3 of them would get together, the lead crew and the other 2. And that's the way we bombed. We either bombed as a group or we bombed in 12 airplanes at a time. That's what they call for. And, you know, we get a report from the gunners and the bombardier how the bombs hit. And we either missed the target or we hit it pretty good. We had electric suits run by electricity and little things all through them. You wore that, and that kept you, your feet and your neck and everything kept you warm. And if that went out, you sit there and you froze yourself to death. Some people did that. I never was that unlucky, but that was terrible when they do that. They get a burst of flak through the airplane, knock out all the electricity. So you froze. And other things that happened to you where you'd get a big piece of shell through your front end of your airplane and all that air going through there. I got my nose knocked out one time and I thought I was sitting in a 100-mile-an-hour wind, which I was. I was sitting in a 150-mile-an-hour wind coming up through that cockpit. And that was tough to take. But it all seemed to, the big man had hold of us, seemed to have us by the nape of the neck and leading us through all that stuff.
2 fighters, 6 o'clock up, coming in, diving out, Chief.
B-17 in trouble out at 2 o'clock, watching.
Got an engine on fire.
You kind of felt like you was fighting to get back to England so you could go on another one. That was kind of the mentality you conjured up.
B-17 out of control at 3 o'clock.
And I saw many airplanes go down, guys I knew, or knew casually at least.
Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out.
There's one, he come out of the bomb bay. Yeah, I see him.
There's a tail gunner coming out.
And it was a sad feeling. I read in the newspaper just recently, in the last day or two, where there was 36,000 dead in the 8th Air Force. That's not counting the thousands of guys that were shot down, became prisoners of war. But that was a mess of people. In fact, I got to know a lot of parents after I got back to the States, call them up, go see them, and what have you. When we weren't flying, we'd get what they call 3-day passes. Well, most of us, 90% of us, would jump on the train there at the station near the base and head for London, because it was a playful city. And a lot of booze and a lot of dancing and nice ladies to take us to breakfast, and what have you. So that part was very, very interesting. So it was a great experience. I wouldn't like to do it again, but I'm glad I did it once. Some guys flew two tours, but they walk around kind of funny around the bar all the time. We knew everything that was going on and what the Germans were getting their butts kicked off and how far back they had been driven and exactly what was happening when they surrendered, the day they surrendered. Then I hung around for a couple of weeks and the colonel was nice to me and he gave me an airplane with some people to fly home in it, in this B-17s, which he didn't give them to everybody. But he liked me and he was from Texas and I got along good with him. Well, there was a guy on the airplane said, "Wilson, what are you going to do when you get back to the States after the war?" I said, "Major, I'll tell you one thing I'm going to do. I'm going to get out of this man's uniform because I don't care for people like you, for one thing." "Oh, now," he said, "let's don't talk that way." I said, "Well, you've been on my back ever since we left." This was in Iceland. I said, "Ever since we left England, you've been telling me how to fly my airplane." I said, "I probably got a hell of a lot more time than you got." But he was an older guy. He was probably 30 at that time. He's an old man, gray hair. Named Buzz Slingsby from California. So as we'd stop at each one of these places, Iceland, Greenland, Labrador, we'd go spend a night in the barracks and gas up and leave the next day and go to our next place, finally into Connecticut. Well, we get into Connecticut and I'm getting off the airplane, getting my parachute and stuff off there, and he says, he started calling me Lug. I don't know where that came from. He said, "Hey, Lug, what are you going to?" He's standing there with hands on his hips. He says, what are you going to do after the war?" "Really?" He says, "Would you like to fly?" I said, "Yeah, what do you know about it?" He said, "Well, I run the Philippine Airlines. I ran it before the war, and then I had to leave there." He said, "How'd you like to go to work for me?" So, man, that thrilled me to death, even though the war wasn't over in Japan. So I came back and got transferred on purpose to California. Well, he had gone to Manila by this time. So I get to go to Honolulu, and I get to know the colonel over at Honolulu, and he gets me permission to go to Manila. The war's over now, and to go to Manila for discharge. And I went to Manila, but when I got there, Pappy Gunn, the originator of the Philippine Airlines, who was an old Navy man, quite a hero under MacArthur, had run Buzz off, run him back to the States. But at least Pappy knew I was coming. He gave me my job flying a C-47 DC-3. One day I'm flying from Manila, regular run, sitting above the cloud, just my Philippine co-pilot and I, and somebody taps me on the shoulder. And I turn around and see who that is, and it's a girl standing there, stewardess, flight attendant. We called them flight attendants, and then the whole world changed them flight attendants because our boss thought a stewardess was worked in a cat house. And so he made us quit calling them stewardesses like they did all over the world, England, Germany, United, everywhere. And the whole thing got together and named them flight attendants, and they're all flight attendants till this day. So I looked down at her, and there's a cute little Filipino girl with a cup in her hand, paper cup, but there was nothing in the paper cup. And I says, well, what do you want? I'm thinking, what, this dummy with a paper cup in her hand? She said, well, Captain, I just want to know if I can bring you some coffee. Well, actually, I wasn't even a coffee drinker. So I said, no, I don't think I want any coffee. And I said, if that's all you got to do, why don't you go sit down? Carry around a paper cup, I said. Well, that didn't go over big. She slammed that door when she went back out to where the cabin. Her name was Connie Taylor, and she was the chief stewardess on the airline. And 2 months later, we were married.